Good morning. I am Amanda Cavage. I'm a researcher and bioethicist at the University of Minnesota for the Microbiota Therapeutics Research Program, working alongside Dr. Alexander Koretz. But today I'll also be speaking as a former recurrent C. difficile patient myself and recipient of FMT. So I'd like to start by giving you a little picture of the kind of person I am. Before I got sick with C. diff, I was balancing a full-time research job at the university, studying the genetics of pediatric cancer, while simultaneously getting my master's degree in science policy and bioethics. I love to travel, and I'm the kind of person who will spontaneously buy airline tickets and find myself in another country a few weeks later. I'm a runner. I love to go to the gym. These days I lift weights, and I used to play racquetball quite frequently. So I've always been a very active, adventurous person. And then in 2012, I became sick with C. diff, and every single aspect of my life came to a screeching halt for 14 months. That's how long I was sick. I went through many antibiotic treatments that didn't work, and each came with their own debilitating side effects that were sometimes worse than C. diff itself. One particular antibiotic caused such severe neurological side effects that I ended up in the emergency room because I couldn't remember what I had done an hour prior. It was a really terrifying experience to go through. But there was this particular moment for me when I really realized how sick I had become and how malnourished I had become. And it was one morning when I was in the shower and clumps of my hair had started falling out. And being a cancer researcher, I thought to myself, this is what happens to chemo patients, not to C. diff. But then I got FMT, and in days, I started feeling better, and I knew it worked. 1 month later, I was back at the gym, and 2 months later, I was on an airplane again, and I got my life back. And despite 14 months of suffering, I still consider myself one of the lucky ones. Being in this field, I consider my case to be moderate in comparison to a lot of the horror stories I've heard, and I had access to FMT. If enforcement discretion were to go away, patients far sicker than I was will not have access, and they will suffer, and many will die. Enforcement discretion has given tens of thousands of people access to a life-saving therapy. It was the moral thing to do. It's not to say we haven't had challenges or that mistakes haven't been made along the way, but it was the right thing to do. And so I'd like to briefly discuss some of the impacts that enforcement discretion has had on this field and propose a solution forward. One of the major oversights was the missed opportunity to collect data on 50 to 100,000 patients who have already been treated with FMT under enforcement discretion. The lack of this data has limited our scientific understanding of safety, efficacy, and mechanisms of FMT. And this data is crucial for a new emerging field like microbiome where we don't know a lot about this yet. We could have obtained an impressively large data set of real clinical world experience that I might argue is even more valuable than data we're collecting from clinical trials. My career started out in genetic epidemiology, so I'm a little biased, but also no stranger to large-scale observational studies. I know they can provide valuable information that clinical trials simply cannot capture. In my opinion, from the beginning, enforcement discretion should have been coupled with outcome data collection, but it's not too late to mandate it. The continuation of enforcement discretion would allow us to collect safety and efficacy data on a much larger C. difficile population than clinical trials can capture. And there's an efficient way for doing so, using patient registries. Again, when I go back to my work in genetic epidemiology, I helped develop registries for pediatric cancer patients. The Childhood Cancer Research Network has data on over 90% of cancer diagnoses for kids in this country. And that's a far cry from the data we've been able to collect on C. diff patients. But again, I emphasize it's not too late to start capturing that data. We're already doing this at the University of Minnesota. I personally have created a patient registry in which we capture data on all of our patients receiving FMT under enforcement discretion. We collect medical history data so we can understand the type of patients that we're working with. And we ask physicians to provide safety and efficacy data at multiple time points, 1 to 2 weeks after receiving FMT, and to collect longitudinal data, we collect it at 1 month, 2 months, 6 months, and 1 year. Physicians who wish to use our FMT product are required to provide this this data in order to continue having access to our FMT product. asking physicians to provide a minimal amount of information is not unreasonable. Our registry only takes a couple minutes to complete. So it is considered that the gold standard in drug research is the randomized clinical trial. But there are limitations with RCTs. In this situation we found ourselves in, I think it's important to ask, are the participants that are participating in these clinical trials representative of the patients who will be receiving FMT after the FDA approves a product? Is this data generalizable to all patients who have received FMT under enforcement discretion? And in my experience as a researcher in this field, I think the answer is no. Recurrent C. difficile patients, by their very definition, are incredibly sick individuals, which is why they require FMT in the first place. Many of these patients have comorbidities, and they are excluded from clinical trial participation. You can go into clinicaltrials.gov and see the eligibility criteria for each of these trials. They all exclude patients who are immunocompromised, those who have IBD, those who have history of GI surgeries, and even people with IBS, which we know is a generalized term applied to a lot of undiagnosed GI problems. And in our practice already, we know that IBD patients with C. diff respond differently. We know that post-infection IBS is very common. We need large-scale observational studies to understand the complexity of these patients. Safety and efficacy data from these minimal number of clinical trials is simply not adequate. If I was sick today, I would not be eligible for any of these clinical trials based on a former misdiagnosis of IBD and an IBS diagnosis. My data would not have been collected without enforcement discretion, but instead I am a published data point for our research program at the University of Minnesota. And it's not to say that clinical trials are unnecessary. I just think we've found ourselves in a situation where clinical trials and enforcement discretion need to coexist successfully. It's been argued that clinical trial recruitment has been struggling because of enforcement discretion. I don't agree. I think it is the very strict eligibility criteria that limits the patient population. If 100,000 patients have recurrent C. diff and only about 10,000 are being treated by open biome, there's 90,000 some patients left over. But the pressure of this recruitment struggle put us in a situation where a proposal was drafted listing conditions for which C. diff patients could still receive FMT under enforcement discretion, but trying to help recruitment in clinical trial research. And as a bioethicist, I was really deeply concerned with what I had read. When I read this proposal, it seemed reasonable at first. Patients with severe cases of C. diff could still get FMT from their doctors, as well as those who live too far from clinical trial sites or simply didn't meet eligibility criteria. But what the proposal lacked was an option for people who simply don't want to be part of a clinical trial. Research participation must always be voluntary, free of coercion, as stated by the Belmont Report. The fact that a violation of human subjects' ethical guidelines was even suggested should sound alarms. Are we willing to sacrifice patient autonomy for financial gains? I empathize with participant recruitment because it's not an easy task. In my 12 years of research experience, I can probably count on one hand how many times I've met my recruitment goal. It's hard work, but the burden of participant recruitment must always fall on the investigative research team and not on patients seeking treatment. This is just not an acceptable solution, but mandating the collection of safety and efficacy data through patient registries is. I know the situation we found ourselves in is unique, but FMT is unique. It's not like other drugs, and we know that. We've only touched the surface in this new field of microbiome research, and we should proceed with caution and optimism, learning from our experience with C. diff, especially as we move into treating many other indications that show promise. We need to consider off-label use and really consider the restriction of any of FDA-approved products to solely C. diff. I fear that if we allow off-label use for other indications, we could potentially be finding ourselves in a dangerous situation as that we found with this summer with the unfortunate death. Enforcement discretion brought FMT into the spotlight and into the headlines and gave access to C. diff patients who were looking for an end to their suffering the same way I was. There's plenty of science already to show this is safe and effective for this disease. It has saved tens of thousands of lives, including mine, and it would be highly unethical at this point to even consider terminating enforcement discretion, knowing we have a treatment that works. I'm here today because of enforcement discretion. Thank you very much.